It's been called a logistics masterpiece. It was also the British Army's last campaign in North America. Today, I'm joined by Canadian author and historian Paul McNicholls to talk about the Red River Campaign of 1870. Paul has written a book about it called Journey Through the Wilderness. It's a fascinating and little-known part of British military history, but it is very important. The campaign helped to solidify the country we now call Canada, and it was also the first independent command of a man called Sir Garnet Wolseley, an officer who went on to become a Field Marshal and Commander-in-Chief of the British Armed Forces. And by the way, guys, if you want a 20% discount on Paul's book, Helion have very kindly given us a code to allow you to do that. So stay tuned till the end of the episode and I'll give you that code. Also, if you're interested in the Anglo-Zulu War, who isn't, then stay tuned until the end as we find out if James Langley Dalton, who famously won a VC at Rorke's Drift, was actually part of the Red River Campaign, as is usually claimed by historians. In fact, it was a discussion on that issue in my YouTube comments that led Paul and I to first speak. Happy New Year, guys. I hope that the holiday period is treating you well. Today's guest, Paul McNicholls, is a lovely guy who really knows his stuff. I started off by asking him to give us the background to the Red River Expedition.
The Canada geographically that we know today is not the Canada that we're talking about in 1869 when this event kicks off. Four of Britain's North American colonies have formed the Dominion of Canada in 1867, and it now consists of 5 provinces. But it's quite a small entity by comparison with what Canada becomes. And in 1869, the Canadians are looking to take over the Hudson's Bay Company's lands, which is the vast majority of what today we would know as Western Canada. So what happens is the largest settlement in the Hudson's Bay Company lands is the Red River settlement, which is the modern day site of Winnipeg. There's about 14,000 people there. Almost half of them are French-speaking people of mixed ethnicity, known as the Metis. And they are a bit uneasy about the Canadian takeover. They're looking for guarantees for their land rights and their culture, and they're not forthcoming from Canada. And so they decide to take matters into their own hands and make the demands directly to the Canadian government. And that's what triggers the unrest at the Red River settlement, which ultimately results in the dispatch of the Red River Expeditionary Force in 1870.
Okay, so to give people a bit more perspective then, the Hudson Bay Company, who owned all that land, would that be the equivalent of, say, the East India Company or something like that?
It's a company, the charter of the Hudson's Bay Company dated from 1670, when Charles II gave monopoly trading rights to all lands within the Hudson's Bay watershed. He probably had absolutely no idea of the scale of territory he was talking about, but we're talking about thousands and thousands of square miles. And over time, the Hudson's Bay Company, and that territory that was formed the original charter, was known as Rupert's Land or Prince Rupert's Land. And over time, the company expanded into other parts of the North American interior as well. And that became known as the Northwestern Territory. So you're talking about, massive amounts of real estate.
And at this point, then, this was when they being I assume the British colonial authorities wanted to federalize Canada into one country. Then that's essentially the backdrop.
Well, essentially the backdrop. I mean, the Confederation was driven. There were domestic Canadian reasons behind the Confederation of those colonies in 1867. But there was no question as well that the British government were supportive of it. And they were supportive of it for a number of reasons. One of which was they thought it would give the area greater defensibility against what had turned into an American powerful military power in the post-Civil War period. And so they wanted to give their North American colonies a better chance of defending themselves. But as I say, there were also domestic Canadian issues or colonial issues that were behind the Confederation as well.
And the Metis, I think you said they were called. The Metis were against this because they didn't have any. They wanted their land rights to be protected and so on, and that wasn't forthcoming.
Yeah, they weren't necessarily against it. They were suspicious of it, and they wanted the guarantees up front. And in fairness to the Canadian government at the time, they had a number of issues on their plate. It's a brand new country. One of the first things that happens after Confederation is that one of the provinces wants out. Almost immediately, one of the provinces wants to get out. So the Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, is dealing with that. He's also dealing with the threat of Irish American veterans of the Civil War raiding north into Canada, which begins about 1864 and continues until 1871. So he's got a number of issues on his plate. And one of the things you have to remember is that the Red River settlement is a long way away. But there's no question that Macdonald miscalculates, and he doesn't realize the scope of the opposition. And it's not necessarily that they are, completely opposed to the concept, but they want their guarantees. They want their guarantees regarding land rights, and they want guarantees regarding culture.
And when did this move, or how did this move then from a political debate into something that required a military expedition?
Well, it's likely that Canada, once they had taken control, would have sent a military force west anyway. They're going to want to establish Canadian law, and they're going to want to defend what essentially is a new Canadian empire in the West. They're going to want to defend it. There had been two prior military forces sent to the settlement, once in 1846 and again in 1857, smaller than the expeditionary force that we're talking about in 1870. But so it's likely that a force would have been sent. What happens is that when the Métis, under the gentleman who rises to become their leader, a fellow by the name of Louis Riel, when they ultimately do manage to hammer out a settlement, it's difficult at the settlement itself because you have other groups at the settlement as well that don't necessarily have the same concerns that the Métis do. But once they manage to sort out an agreement, they then send representatives to Ottawa, and a negotiated settlement is achieved. But in the interim, an event has happened at the settlement that kind of changes the fabric. In March of 1870, Riel sanctions the execution of a prisoner at Upper Fort Garry, which is the HBC's headquarters at the Red River settlement. A guy by the name of Thomas Scott, who is apparently a difficult individual. Whether or not that justifies him being executed is a different story, but it changes the tone of everything. And even though a negotiated settlement is achieved, there's an uproar in Ontario that they want a military expedition sent to avenge the death of Scott. And so backing up regarding the military expedition, early on, once Macdonald, the Prime Minister, gets wind that something's going on, he starts to think in terms of sending a military expedition. And some of his early comments are quite belligerent. But the Canadians just do not have the expertise to do it by themselves. And so they need the British to participate. Now, the British Prime Minister at the time is Gladstone. And he is not really interested in sending a military expedition to the West. And neither is his colonial secretary, Lord Granville. So they're very, very reluctant. So they actually impose on the Canadian government a number of conditions for British participation. And one of them is that we're not doing it alone. We'll send a small force, but you will send a larger Canadian force that will accompany it. But we're not sending any British troops west until you've reached an agreement with the people at the Red River settlement and the Hudson's Bay Company lands have been transferred to Canadian authority. So those are the conditions. It's an interesting thing. And you know, I know we've talked about this a little bit. What is it? What is the expedition? Is it a force to establish Canadian law and order in the West, or is it a punitive expedition? And certainly in the minds of the British government, it's a force, it's just to establish law and order after a political has been achieved. But the English-speaking members of the Canadian forces have a very different approach. Most of them have signed on because they want to avenge Scott's death. And the closer the force gets to the Red River settlement, and we'll talk about the commander of the British force as we go through this, but Garnet Wolseley, the closer he gets, the more, if you believe his later writings, and he wrote, a fairly long time after the event, you get the impression he thinks he's leading a punitive expedition.
Well, before we dive into the expedition too much, one thing I was interested, there's two people I'd love a little mini potted history or potted biography from if possible. Firstly, why did people care about Scott? You mentioned he had a bit of a reputation as a troublemaker, but why was he important enough that English-speaking Canadians were mad about his death? And secondly, Louis Riel, could you give us a paragraph or two about who he was and where he came from?
Okay, I guess we should maybe start with Louis Riel then. Louis Riel was born in the Red River settlement. His father, a generation earlier, also Louis Riel, had been involved in the de jure, or I should say de facto, breaking of the Hudson's Bay Company's monopoly for trade in the Northwest. But Riel had been, Louis the son, had been seen as, a fairly intelligent boy. And so he'd been sent to Quebec to study. He had not completed his studies, but then he'd gone into business, but he'd gone to work. And then around 1870, he came back to the settlement just as events were starting to kick off a little bit. And so he rose to the leadership. And I think what you can say about Riel is that he was determined he had a vision of what he was looking to accomplish, and he was determined to push it through. So that's his story up to the Red River expedition. We can maybe, I don't know if you want to talk now about what happened subsequently, or where we talk about that when we get to the end of the story.
I think let's focus on that at the end, I think. Yeah.
And then Scott was he was an Orangeman. He had come to the settlement in I think it was in 1868. In 1868 and 1869, a number of surveyors and then road builders came into the settlement. And this is what kind of set things off a little bit, because they weren't very respectful of the existing landed rights of the Métis there. And so that got the Métis very concerned about what the future was going to bring. Scott was quite a belligerent guy with the road work, with his boss. I mean, I think at one point he assaulted his boss on the roadworks at one point. He was apparently a big, blustery fellow, but without going into all of the details of what happened at the settlement over the winter of 1869 and 1870, he found himself twice taken prisoner and held at Upper Fort Garry. The first time was he escaped. And the second time, he apparently was just very, very difficult to deal with. he was not a particularly well-known figure, but he was used by the Canada First movement in Ontario as sort of a figurehead or a martyr to sort of rally the troops and say, "Hey, look, we need to go and do something about this. They've killed, the Metis have killed one of ours, for lack of a better term." And so he's a rallying cry. And the Canada First movement their vision is to populate what is going to become the Canadian West with Anglo-Saxon settlers. And so this is their opportunity to rally the troops in Ontario.
Right, I see. So that's great. I feel we've got a good understanding of the background now. So then how did Sir Garnet Wolseley get involved? And then what units did he manage to pull together for this expedition?
Okay, so I'll just backtrack one little bit, because there's another. Most people don't know much about the Red River expedition, but if they do, they might know that Garnet Wolseley was the leader, kind of one of the unsung architects of an already unknown campaign. Is a guy by the name of Lieutenant General James Lindsay. Now, what happens, just to set the background, as Canada is requesting the use of British troops, or the participation of British troops in the expedition, the British government has announced that they're withdrawing the garrison from Canada. So it's not particularly the best time to. These are all part of the army reforms that are the Cardwell reforms that are beginning at this time, and the British are not going to withdraw from what they consider imperial outposts. So they're going to keep a garrison at Halifax because it's a naval base. It's an imperial naval base. So the senior officer in North America the position has now been transferred to Halifax. But with the agreement for British military participation in the expedition, the War Office gets nervous that the evacuation of the garrison won't take place on schedule. They've decided that their troops are out by the end of 1870. And so Lindsay is sent to Montreal to make sure that everything goes according to plan. So Lindsay is extremely competent, but he arrives to find that a document has been put together by Wolseley, essentially laying out the operation for him. Wolseley's already in Canada. He's been in Canada since the end of 1861. He's been sent to Canada as in the aftermath of the Trent incident at the start of the American Civil War. And as a response to that, the British send about 10,000 troops to their possessions in British North America. So he's still there in 1870. And by this point, he's established himself as an extremely competent, forward-thinking, reforming individual. And when you factor in that he's also put this document together laying out how this expedition needs to be carried out, he's the logical choice to lead it. And Lindsay, it's one of the first things that Lindsay does after he arrives. He appoints Wolseley. So you also asked about the troops involved. So from the British perspective, it's quite easy. They just designate one of the battalions that is still part of the garrison in Canada, and that's the 1st Battalion, King's Royal Rifle Corps, the 60th Rifles. And there's also an Royal Artillery contingent with 4 brass 7-pounder guns, and there's a Royal Engineer contingent. Where it gets a little murky is, given that the Canadians have been the driving force behind this, when Lindsay arrived, not very happy to find out that the Canadians have done nothing to determine what military force they're going to send. Remember, the British government has stipulated that a larger Canadian force must accompany the British. The Canadian military at this point, it's a long story of the evolution of the Canadian military, but you have a number of what's called active militia battalions around the country. Lindsay, when he arrives, he goes to the Canadian Militia Department in no uncertain terms, says, how come you haven't done anything? You're the driving force behind this. And there's a regiment in Canada called the Royal Canadian Rifles. It's actually a regiment of the British Army, but it's permanently stationed in Canada. It's going to be disbanded after the withdrawal. And so Lindsay says to the militia department, why don't we just send the Royal Canadian Rifles? They're ready to go. And the Canadian Militia Department rejects this and they're saying, no, we're gonna raise 2 battalions of rifles, one in Quebec and one in Ontario. Lindsay doesn't like the idea of this, but he doesn't have any control over it. So they then go through the process of raising these 2 battalions. No problem in getting men in Ontario. The whole Scott issue is causing them to, they've got an abundance of men wanting to go. Quebec is a different story. And there's 2 issues with Quebec. One is not a lot of the French-speaking militia are willing to go. But there's the other problem is English-speaking militia members in Quebec don't want to serve under French-speaking officers. So it's problematic. It's not going anywhere. So Lindsay steps in. He basically designates about 120 men from the Royal Canadian Rifles to go, and he recruits the rest in Ontario. So there's 3 battalions. They're small battalions, 7 companies each, about 350 men in each of the 3 battalions, and plus the other attached forces.
Okay, so it's a fairly strong force to have to navigate such a long way across country, and I guess that's a great place to sort of talk about the challenges that they were going to face and the logistical issues involved.
Yeah, well, they're going to travel over 1,200 miles in total. The last 550 miles are going to be across country. So once they have managed to get the Canadian troops into a position where they can go, they're going to travel by rail from Toronto to a place called Collingwood on Lake Huron. They're then going to go by steamer from Lake Huron to Thunder Bay on Lake Superior. And then there's a road, and the road is going to go from Thunder Bay up to a place called Shebandown Lake. And once they get onto Shebandown Lake, they've had these purpose-built rowboats, and they're going to row and portage and haul all their equipment across 550 miles of incredibly rough terrain, with a total of 47 portages along the way, ranging in length from 100 yards to over a mile.
So I'm just going to cut in. What exactly is a portage?
A portage is basically the land bit between the water bit, where you're going onto a different river, a different lake. And so you've got to unload the boats, haul them over, haul all the supplies over, and then get the men and all their equipment over, get back in the boats, and then set off again. Extremely hard, physical, challenging work. And not to mention the fact that when they're in their boats, it's not necessarily great conditions either. They could be running rapids or challenging water conditions as well. So it's a very, very challenging prospect. Part of the problem is that there's really no good routes between Canada as it exists in 1869 and the lands that are going to become the Canadian West. In some ways, that was intended by the Hudson's Bay Company. I don't think we have time to go back to the history, but the Hudson's Bay Company had a rival called the Northwest Company. And essentially, they fought a bit of a war between themselves in the Northwest. And finally, the British government had had enough and essentially forced a merger in 1821. So the route that the expedition will ultimately take is essentially the canoe highway of the Northwest Company. It's after 1821, it falls into disuse because the Hudson's Bay Company's model works best in isolation. So their transport is from Hudson's Bay up the Hayes River onto Lake Winnipeg and then down to the Red River settlement.
So I'm interested to know, in the course of your research, are there many first-hand accounts of this journey? Were you able to really get a sense of how difficult it was?
Oh yeah, there were the first-hand accounts come from. There were quite a number of people who participated, who left accounts. There's nothing really from the British enlisted men. There's some accounts from the officers. And then there's accounts from some of the Canadians, whether they're enlisted or officers. I think they were more literate than the British enlisted men. So they left accounts. But then there's also the field diaries of the office. Some of the officers, I was able to go through a number of those. So yeah, there's lots of good information about the conditions. Interestingly, the force did not, once they took to the rowboats, the force did not travel as a compact force. They were spread out over about 150 miles. So you get different accounts from different individuals when they're passing the same place. If you understand what I mean. They don't necessarily have the same experience as the guy who passed through a week earlier. So that makes it kind of interesting as well. So let me just go. Sorry, go ahead.
Just quickly, Paul, I was interested to know, you say the column was very, very spread out. Was there any fear during the journey that they could be attacked? Or did they know that there was no chance they were going to be attacked en route? Because it just strikes me that if you were the Metis and if you were very aggressive minded, you could potentially have wiped this column out in small pieces during their journey. But was that never an issue?
Well, that's a great question. They looked at, first of all, Wolseley is extremely organized and he's planned this to the nth degree. They look at essentially three possible opponents during the journey. First of all, they're always nervous about the Fenians. The day they land at Thunder Bay, there is a battle fought on the Quebec frontier between Fenian raiders and Canadian militia. So the Fenians are real, but they never, and measures were taken to prevent or to fend off any Fenian attacks, but no, the Fenians didn't have anything planned.
Just on that point, for anyone who's listening who might not be familiar with the term Fenian, essentially that's Irish American Civil War veterans, right?
That's right, and their goal is to put pressure on Britain to free Ireland by attacking other parts of the British Empire.
Right.
So that's one of the perceived threats. And I will add that in 1871, the Fenians do raid up to, or try to raid up towards the Red River settlement. The second potential opponent is there's worries that the First Nations people who are in the path of the expedition might choose to oppose it. They sent a political officer on ahead, and he was able to come back to Wolseley, who was traveling out, and assure him that there wasn't going to be any opposition from them. As far as the Métis, I mean, the Métis, there was a political deal that had been done, and so the Métis, I don't think. There's no evidence that the Métis ever intended to oppose the arrival of the force. But Wolseley certainly took measures and worried about the potential of it. he sort of loaded the forward elements of his force. He took his artillery with him, or two of his four guns. He left two of the guns at a fort he had built at Thunder Bay, but he took two of the guns, and they were with the forward elements of the force. He had they traveled in what was called boat brigades, which was about essentially 6 boats in each boat brigade. And the boat brigade is it's not a military term. It's a holdover from the heyday of the fur trade. And so he had 3 of his boat brigades up front loaded, and it was the 60th Rifles that were the vanguard of the expedition. And just in case he ran into any trouble, he was always wary of that. With hindsight, and I think he did the right thing, but with hindsight, we know that there was little chance of physical or military opposition, and the real challenge of the expedition was the elements.
And what do you think Wolseley did particularly well during this expedition? You know, because this obviously, and maybe we'll talk more about this in a minute, but this was the beginning of quite a stellar career. Yeah. Looking back, what do you think Wolseley did well, and maybe what did he not do so well?
Well, I think the logistics. He got the logistics and the planning just right. I mean, the boats were exceedingly loaded down with supplies, because essentially once they got into the wilderness, they had to be self-sufficient. There were, we need to add that there were guides and boatmen that accompanied the force. These had been hired by the Canadian Public Works Department. Wolseley didn't have a lot of good things to say about many of them, but he had nothing but positive things to say about a group of Iroquois boatmen and guides that had been hired from villages around Montreal. So Wolseley got the logistics and the planning spot on. We haven't talked about, and maybe we will in a minute, about sort of the 3 challenges that they overcame before they set out on Shebendowin Lake and then their journey across the wilderness. And one of those was the problems of the road from Thunder Bay to Shebendowin Lake. And at one point, Wolseley took the decision that he was going to haul his boats up the river. The road was to be built to bypass a very, very challenging river, and the road just wasn't getting the job done. So he decided to haul the boats up the river. It was controversial. The Canadian Public Works man who was overseeing the construction of the road and had overseen the construction of the boats was very much opposed to this move, but I think Wolseley got that right. Things that maybe Wolseley didn't get right, a little bit of maybe hubris here and there. There was an incident they got to a place along the way called Lake of the Woods, which is quite a large lake with a great many islands. And Wolseley had delayed his move for a few days at a place called by the name of Fort Francis. Fort Francis was a Hudson's Bay Company post, and Wolseley had decided to set up an advanced base there. And so he delayed there a few days to make sure that was done to his satisfaction. So this meant that the forts arrived at Lake of the Woods, and it was great wind. And for one of probably the few times in the expedition, the troops unfurled their sails on the boats and they just raced across the lake to a place called Rat Portage, which is the site of like modern day Kenora, Ontario. By the time Wolseley arrived, a storm had blown up. And so he was forced to take shelter on an island in Lake of the Woods. And after a couple of days, he was really wanted to get going. And his Iroquois guide said, no, it's still too rough. They were traveling by canoe rather than the larger rowboats. And they also had a gig. So he set out without a guide in the gig, and he got lost. By the time he managed to bump into a First Nations family, and they led him into Rat Portage. But he was the alarm bells were ringing by this point, because they thought, the lead elements of the expedition thought that the commander had disappeared into nowhere.
So Garnet Wolseley, arrogant and showing hubris, you do shock me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, great leader. The men apparently were devoted to him. But yeah, definitely a bit of arrogance on the part of Sir Garnet.
I mean, we're going off on a slight tangent, but one of my interests, as I'm sure you're aware, is the Anglo-Zulu War, and pretty much everything Sir Garnet Wolseley writes about everybody is he just really dislikes everybody around him. Generally, he was very very annoyed at Chard and Bromhead and their VCs at Rorke's Drift, and he just seemed to generally dislike most people. I don't know if that comes out in the Red River expedition.
It does. His arrogance. I mean, and his arrogance definitely does come out. It's interesting that he was hoping to not just appointed commander of the force. He also wanted to be appointed lieutenant governor of the new territory. But the Canadian government decided to go in a different direction. So when he arrived at Fort Garry, Louis Riel was still in residence at the fort, but I think he'd possibly gotten wind of the belligerent nature that the expedition was showing, when you consider that they were actually arriving at a settlement where a political deal had already been done. So he made himself scarce as the expedition was approaching the fort, which I think was a wise move on his part. Wolseley chose not to go in pursuit, and I think that was the right thing to do. I'm just not 100% sure on what Wolseley's real motivation was. Was it that what he later wrote was that he had no civil authority, his military task had been completed, so there was no reason for him to go in pursuit of Riel? Or was it, which I wonder, was it because he was a little miffed that they didn't make him lieutenant governor as well?
Well, I think that's a good point then, just to sort of jump forward to the arrival. So firstly, can you give us a sense of how long the journey took, and then just sum up what happened when they finally arrived? Sure.
The first British troops landed at Thunder Bay 94 days before the British troops arrived at Fort Garry. But a lot of that time was spent on the road, trying to get the road to Shebandown Lake in order. And that's actually the road is probably the biggest controversy of the expedition. But anyway, so it's 94 days from landing until they get there. I'll add that it rains sometimes torrentially on 45 of those days. And then we factor in the insects, which anybody who leaves a record of it definitely talks about the insects. There's one, I think, quite interesting story. One of the officers who tells a pretty good story, one of the British officers, they had mosquito oil, which apparently was useless and probably harmful to them because it contained creosote. Oh. And he was in his tent one night, and there was a bottle of something next to him, and he doused himself in it to try and fend off all the mosquitoes. In the morning, he discovered it was a bottle of sauce. Oh. So he'd probably made himself even more attractive to the mosquitoes. But yeah, so 94 days to get there. When they arrive at a place called Fort Alexander, which is at near the mouth of the Winnipeg River. And from there, they're going to enter Lake Winnipeg, and then they're going to essentially hang a left and then enter the Red River. And by the time Wolseley arrives at Fort Alexander, all of the British troops are there. And as he's traveling by canoe, and he's passed through the two leading Canadian boat brigades. He later writes about information that he's receiving from English-speaking residents of the settlement, to hurry up, and get here because we don't know what's going to happen. He writes this quite a long time afterwards, and you got to. It's not that there hadn't been issues at the settlement over that winter, but is he telling a good story? The traditional story. The settlement under siege, and I've got to get there, before something bad happens. If you listen to some of the really reliable British officers' sources who are with him, they don't think that there's going to be any form of opposition. And if he really thought there was going to be some form of opposition, I would have expected that he would have waited for those two Canadian brigades to arrive, but he didn't. He set off and he gets into the Red River settlement, and a massive storm is about to hit. And so for the last couple of days, the troops, as they make their way up the Red River, they're getting lashed with rain. He wants to make sure that nobody at the settlement knows that they're there, because when he arrives at Lower Fort Garry, of course, if there's an Upper Fort Garry, there's going to be a Lower Fort Garry. When he arrives at Lower Fort Garry, he's told by the Hudson's Bay Company man there that nobody knows. They don't realize that the force has gotten there yet. So he wants to make sure of that. So anybody who comes from the direction of Upper Fort Garry is going to stay. They're not going back to let on. The last night they spend in a driving rainstorm, the troops out in the open. They get back in the boats because by this point the road is a morass of mud. They get back in the boats the following morning. They row to within about 2 miles of the upper fort. They get out. They get into battle formation, and they approach the fort. And a lot of the accounts speak of, wondering whether they're going to be fired on, but the really reliable officer accounts, I don't think they really expect that there's going to be any kind of an action. And as I mentioned, the Riel and the few supporters that are with him at this point, they figure discretion, the better part of valor, and they make themselves scarce, and that's probably wise.
So that's pretty much the end of the expedition, is it? Nothing. There's no further. They don't have to advance and take any other towns or villages. It's kind of that done and dusted at that point. It's done and dusted, basically, from the British perspective. You have to remember that the British have imposed on themselves. They want to get in and out in a season, which is challenging. It's challenging because the ice on Lake Superior doesn't open up until the beginning of May. So they can't even get to Thunder Bay until the beginning of May. And then they get delayed by the road. They arrive at Thunder Bay they start landing around May 25th. They don't set out on Shebandown Lake until July 16th. The forward elements. That's the amount of time. Remember, I talked about that road being the biggest controversy, and my book goes into a great deal of length on the controversy of the road, and also a couple of other pinch points prior to that Wolseley would claim had delayed him. The road definitely delayed him. I don't think that the other pinch points did. From the British perspective, they're always looking at the clock, because if they're going to get in and out in a season, it's a challenge. So anyway, the British arrive. The Canadians start to filter in over beginning in the next few days. And then it's about 2.5 weeks before all of the Canadians have arrived. The British are on their way back in a matter of days. Wolseley's there for 18 days. And then he's making his way back to Canada as well, because the British troops are leaving. The Canadian troops are going to stay. They're going to be the new garrison. And that's where you get into some of the controversies that follow.
there's no question that some of the Canadian troops, there's acts of revenge against some of the Metis. How widespread it is depends on where you sit on the spectrum of this issue today. On the Metis side, they talk about a reign of terror. On the Canadian side, at the time, I think there was an admission that there were some incidents, but that the Canadian troops, some of the firsthand accounts, are quite critical of these incidents as well. But certainly they don't see it as being widespread. But there's no question that, there were some of the Canadian troops did not behave in the way that they should have. But the British are gone. The British are gone very quickly. By the beginning of October, all of the British troops are back in Quebec waiting to be re-embarked for Britain or somewhere else. And Wolseley is gone at the beginning of October. He gets a message from Lindsay suggesting that they travel back to England on the same ship. And so Wolseley doesn't even stop in Toronto. He just blasts on through so he can make the ship with Lindsay. And he's the man of the hour. I mean, he's pulled it off. It's a logistic masterpiece. He's moving on to bigger things, and he wants to get going.
So that's a great point then to ask about Wolseley. So Wolseley, as we've mentioned, went on to become a very big name in the British military. Do you think this was, people talk about, his campaign in Ashanti in modern day Ghana, and the so-called Ashanti Ring of officers who were around him, who he then took, forward with him. But do you think this was the beginning of Wolseley's big steps? And you mentioned in our chat beforehand that some of the officers with him in this campaign were, stayed with him for a long time. That's right.
I think there is some research being done into the rings of the British Army at this time. I think it needs to be rethought a little bit, because it normally is Ashanti that is seen as the beginning of the Wolseley Ring. I think you have to look at Red River as being the beginning of it, because you've got Bowler, he's on Red River. You've got Butler, who also plays a role in South Africa. He's on Red River. McCalmont, the fellow who doused himself in the sauce and has what could have been a potentially career-limiting move in the aftermath of Red River. He serves with him again, and there's quite a number of the officers who will serve with Wolseley again in his future campaigns and form part of his ring.
Brilliant. And then, so moving on, then, why do you think this campaign is worth still researching and remembering? What is it that fascinates you and you think is still relevant for historians now?
Well, I think for one thing, it's the last British Army campaign in North America. The British Army has been there for a long time, and they've been involved in a great many campaigns. This is the last one. I mean, there's no shooting in it, but it's a campaign of considerable accomplishment. And it's the last. I think also it's Wolseley's first independent command. He's demonstrated prior to coming to Canada, he's demonstrated recklessness and great bravery in various campaigns in which he's been involved. He's an officer who's risen solely on merit. In an era of purchase, he doesn't have any money to purchase, so he's had to advance on merit. In Canada, he's become something of a military thinker, and he's created a reputation of competence. Red River just cements that and puts him on the path to bigger and better things, which will ultimately lead to his position as commander-in-chief. And then finally, from a Canadian perspective, from a domestic Canadian perspective, the Red River expedition, sort of is the final piece of the creation of the Canadian West. it's going to have some pretty significant ramifications for the people who are living there already. It's going to see an end of the way of life for a great many of them, but it's also going to see the opening of the West to European colonization, which is, only going to mushroom, and it creates Western Canada.
Brilliant. And one last question, more because for personal interest. Now, you and I started speaking in the comments section under one of my videos on YouTube about James Langley Dalton, who was with the Commissariat in the Anglo-Zulu War. He won a VC at Rorke's Drift. And we had a small debate about whether Dalton was in fact part of the Red River expedition. I understand you've looked into that a bit more, and you might be able to give us a bit more background. Is that possible?
Yes, it is. I wish, it's interesting. I did a great deal of research into Red River, and one of the reviews of my book described it as a forensic analysis, which I was quite pleased with. But I'm still finding out new bits of information, which is why, I saw your comment that he was on Red River, I asked for a citation, and it's a bit vague, so here's what I've found. He was definitely in Canada. He was in Canada from 1868 to 1871. He was in the Army Service Corps from April 1st, 1870, which is essentially when the Army Service Corps is created. The whole logistics and supply of the British Army in 1869, 1870 is going through a considerable revamp. The Red River expedition had 12 Army Service Corps people attached to it. That doesn't necessarily mean that they were with the leading British troops. Doesn't necessarily mean that they traveled with the troops. They could have been involved with the supply across the Great Lakes. But I think there's a very good chance, given that he's in the Army Service Corps. I doubt that there were too many Army Service Corps members in Canada at that time. There's a good chance that he's either with the expedition or he is doing work for it. He doesn't have the Red River clasp for the Canada's General Service Medal, but that's not surprising. The Canada General Service Medal is created by the Canadian government in 1899, and then you apply for the medal, and there were 3 clasps associated with it, one of which was the Red River clasp. He's dead in 1886, so he's not going to be in a position to apply. So I don't think you can look at the lack of the medal and say, well, then he wasn't there. I think that's irrelevant. He wouldn't have had the ability to. So I think, despite all the research I did, a new piece of information.
Brilliant. I'm glad to have been a small part of that, because I actually had just based my research on what I'd read. And as I went back through my sources, I thought, actually, I can't find, exactly where this information's come from. So it was great that you were able to put in that extra research. So thanks for that.
Yeah, my pleasure. His name does not crop up in any of the documents that I read. But then again, he's a staff sergeant, and then he becomes a quartermaster sergeant. He was a staff sergeant from April 1st, 1870, and a quartermaster sergeant from July 1st. He's probably not going to be mentioned. There were 2 or 3 officers who were a supply chain that were mentioned in the documents that I saw. A sergeant is probably not going to be mentioned.
Yeah. And then finally, just to wrap up, you've obviously written a book about the campaign. I see it over your right.
I did. Very strategically placed there.
I just wondered, for anyone who's listening and wants to find out more, can you tell them a little bit about the book and where they might be able to get it?
It's available either through the publisher, Helion and Company. It's on their website. The book is available to order, but on Helion you can also get it's available in ebook form as well. It's also available at Amazon, Yeah, it's out there. It was fun because, this is my first book. I've got two other books that I'm working on at the moment, but I was in a bookstore in Victoria yesterday, and they had a copy of it. So I went up to them and said, "Hey, I'm the author of that book. Do you want me to sign it?" And they said, "Sure." So that was kind of a nice kick for. Interestingly, they never asked for proof that I actually was the author.
I might start doing that. I might just go to bookshops and say I'm the author of the book and start signing them and see if anyone asks me for proof.
Apparently they don't, or at least they didn't in my case.
Brilliant. So there you have it, guys. If you're looking for me over the next few days, I'll be in your local bookstore pretending to be Ian Knight or John LeBand. Just ask me to sign their books. On a serious note though, guys, if you want that promo code for helion.co.uk to get Paul's book with a 20% discount, it's Journey, all capital letters, and then the number 20, the 2 and 0. Journey 20, and you'll get a 20% discount. That's available until the 3rd of February 2022. Please do subscribe, and also consider signing up for my regular dispatch over at redcoathistory.com. If you do, then you'll receive a monthly newsletter crammed with links to great military history content. You'll also get a free book on the Zulu War. If you're particularly generous, you can also support the show by donating to its upkeep over at ko-fi.com/redcoathistory. Any donations will be used to pay for hosting and research. Anyway, guys, hopefully I'll soon be bringing you that episode on the end of the Peninsular War and the invasion of France that I've been promising for ages. And also coming up in the near future is an episode on Kitchener. Your country needs you, that guy. And also on the Shangani Patrol and the birth of Rhodesia. I think you'll find those fascinating.